Hello friends, this is Sajal Devnath and I'm back with the next video in the series for VMware Cloud Assembly. In this video, I'm going to talk about tags and inputs. I'm going to start with tags and next I'm going to talk about inputs. So the first thing we need to understand, what are tags? Now, tags are the most important or critical component of cloud assembly that drives the placement of deployments. So this is like heart of the cloud automation, right? And you need to really understand tags and how they operate to be able to successfully implement CAS in or cloud assembly in production environment. I would say that, right? So tags are like labels that you add to items that's there in cloud assembly, right? You apply the label, like they generally follow the combination name colon value. So name is the name of the tag, and then value is the value that you want to provide to that particular object, right? It's a name colon value convention. You can provide only name, but then it's not really suggested to provide tags or create tags in that way, right? Now, depending on the source of the tags, we can categorize the tags in two ways: external tags and internal tags. So external tags are the tags that you define in vCenter server and other public cloud environments. Those are discoverable by CAS. So if you define anything in vCenter server or AWS, those would be visible in CAS. So you can use those as well. And the internal tags are the tags that you define only in cloud assembly. So you can define and use them in cloud assembly, but then they are not visible into vCenter server. So it's just external tags and internal tags. Now, depending on the nature of the tags, you can categorize them into capability tags and constraint tags. So capability tags are like, you have this capability, you have this 4 CPU servers, and then you have this much storage, this much this is the networking that you have. These are the capabilities that you have. And then constraints are, for example, I want to put this virtual machine on this location only. That is my constraint. Or say you have both Intel based server and AMD based server, and you want your virtual machine to be deployed on AMD based server. So you define a tag which will limit it into deploying only into AMD cluster. So that is a constraint. You are putting a constraint on that element. That's constraint tags. And depending on who creates it, there can be other two types of tags, which is standard tags, which is predefined tags. That's there on the right hand side. You see the standard tags. These are the predefined tags that's there. You won't be able to define them yourself. Once a deployment is done, then these values are already populated. And then there are custom tags which the normal user or any user for that matter creates, defines, and uses in CAS. So standard tags and custom tags, right? And most probably on the 100% of the times you would be working with the custom tags, because the standard tags you cannot write to it directly, you can read them, right? Now, you can define tags in multiple areas, especially project and blueprints. That's where you put the custom constraint tags. Now, if you have defined a tag which is conflicting between blueprint and project, remember that project always takes precedence, right? And sometimes what happens, since you have you know tag types defined as hard or soft tags, if it's not hard defined, if it's a soft tag, that means if there's a conflict and then project takes precedence and the deployment still happens. If you don't want that to happen, then you can define fail on constraint merge conflict. Parameter that particular parameter will not let the deployment happen. So you can define 3 constraints per project, and as I was saying, that there can be hard and soft. If there's a hard constraint, that means it needs to be implemented. If it gets violated, there will be no deployment. On the other hand, soft type of constraint, um, if they fail, still the deployment can happen, right? And just remember, by default all the tags that are created are hard type, so they will be implemented unless until you specifically mention that it's a soft type deployment. In Blueprint, we use the tags in the format you know tag key. You provide the tag key and then colon tag value, provide the tag value, and then mention hard or soft. Hard or soft, it's an optional value. You may not use it, but then if you do not use it, by default it's hard. Now, tag key, when you mention that tag key, that means it's going to be utilized. You can negate that tag key with an exclamation mark. That means wherever this tag is not present, that would be true. So that's the format, right? Just remember, this is the format in which we would mention tags. Now, before we go ahead and talk any further, we would expand that in future slides. But then, how tags work? So you have Cloud Zone, where you define capability tags, and then project and image, where you define constraint tags. Then you have storage capability tags or network profile capability tags. So these are the all areas where you can define tags actually. So storage profile, you have capability tags, and then network profile, you define capability tags. Cloud zone, it is again a capability tags because it's defining, you have these resources, right? Whereas project and image, you define constraint tags because they define the constraints there. And then finally, when you define your blueprint, you define your constraints. So all of this come together because in blueprint you define which cloud zone to use, which project and other things that to use. So you can define all those tags into your blueprint. All of that comes into compliance when you define something which is everything is compliant to it. Then you get your VM, and based on the tags, it gets to be deployed in any of the areas, public clouds. It can be on a VMware cloud on AWS, or it can be private cloud or infra. So your tags actually define, you may have hundreds of environments available to you, but then your tags will define where to put that virtual machine, which image to use, and then which network to use, which storage to use. You can define all of them. You can drive all of them through tags. Actually, when we say that it's cloud based automation and it's policy driven, this is where the policies comes you know and helps you. You have the profiles, and then you define the tags, and then checks whether the tags matches to the it complies to the requirements or not, right? Now, there are many implementation considerations before you go ahead and actually implement a tag. So let's go ahead and have a look at those. The first consideration is, typically you should create tags for your different environments. For example, if you have AWS, Azure, and vSphere, three different environments, you should create a tag which will identify and differentiate between these environments. The similar things will apply for compute resources. Say for example, within vSphere environment, you have a production environment or a test cluster or test dev environment. So you should tag them accordingly, so that, I mean, if you intend to put your or deploy your virtual machines based on the locations where you want to put it, then definitely you should create separate tags for them. Then based on the locations or regions. And this is typically true for AWS, Azure, public clouds, where you have different regions available to you, or into vCenter servers as well. So you have multiple data centers, multiple locations, right? So you should create tags based on this. So these are typical guidelines for which you should create tags and differentiate, so that your deployment can decide at the runtime where to put those virtual machines. The next thing that you should consider is within a location storage. If you have a flat storage, that's absolutely fine. You don't need any separate tags for them. But then if you have separate different types of storage, different capabilities, and you want to steer them, then definitely you should create separate tags for them. Same thing goes for your network. You should have networking for production, and then test dev, and then DMZ. All those segregations, you should create separate tags so that at the runtime you can select, or say while creating blueprints you should be able to select, okay, this is the network it should be deployed to, and based on the selection, based on the tag, it would be placed in that network. And then you should create and coordinate blueprint constraint tags. The constraints that you are putting into the blueprint, it should match to your cloud zone capability. Now few things, you should coordinate tags on network and storage so that they make logical sense. For example, you have a tier 1 storage, which is a production environment, and then you have a network for production and dev. So you should not, you wouldn't want to deploy a virtual machine tagged to a production or say tier 1 storage, but then network is tagged as say dev or test. That doesn't align. So you should create the tags in such a way that network and storage, they should make sense to you. That's the main thing. They should be make sense to you and then your users, right? And coordinate cloud zone and network profile capability tags and other capability tags so that they match and align with the blueprint constraint tags. Now, how do tags work? Right, the first thing that is done is it filters out the cloud zone. When you try to deploy a blueprint, a virtual machine using a blueprint, and there are tags that is defined on that blueprint, so it tries to find out, okay, if I have a single cloud zone, no issues, it's going to be there. But then if there are multiple cloud zones that is defined, then it's going to filter out which cloud zones it can be applicable to, where it can deploy, right? And there are several criteria for selecting that, including availability and profiles, then the tags in the profiles, and then for that particular region and the zone that it belongs to are matched first, right? Then zone and compute capability tags are used to filter the remaining cloud zones. Like if I have hard constraints, which are the zones that I'm not going to utilize? On those filtered zones, like okay, I can use 3 zones where I can deploy. Then if there are same priority levels, at the same priority level, then the soft constraints are checked, like in the it's a combination that is used for cloud zone and compute capabilities. Then after cloud zone is selected, okay, I'm going into this particular cloud zone A, then I need to select a host, which host I'm going to put this virtual machine. And it's matched using a series of filters, like including hard and soft constraints as expressed in blueprints. That's uh, that's how it's selected. And then as we mentioned already, that if there's a tag that is there on the project and then it conflicts with the blueprint, then project tags will take precedence. The best practices for tags, because it's very important, so you should have a clear plan and communicate that plan to all the users, right? So that while selecting or creating the blueprints, and then at the deployment times, users should be able to understand, okay, this is where I want to deploy and these are the things that I need to select. So clear out, and before you actually go ahead and do the tasks, you should have a clear tagging strategy in your mind and in your place. It should be documented and then it should be shared to all the users. Now the plan must support the deployment needs, and then it needs to be human readable and understandable. I can definitely use you know some codes or something cryptic, but then it's not going to help my end users. So you should have the tags named in such a way that it makes sense to you and your environment. That's all. It just needs to be meaningful, and then it needs to make sense to you. And then though you can create tags using a name with no value, as I mentioned in the first slide, that the typical format is name and then colon and then value. You may omit the value portion, but then you should not. That's the best practice, because it can create confusion later on. And this is how my lab environment looks. The lab environment, the example that I'm going to show, this is how it looks. So I have a VMware Cloud Automation Services, and then I have two separate environment. They are completely separate. So one is HCRA. There's a vCenter out there, and then both of them are vCenter based. One is VMC on AWS, another one is on-prem. So I have VRO servers driving my logic, extensibility logic in both the environment. The right side, my on-prem environment is CMBU lab, and then I have ABX actions, on-prem ABX actions, so the cloud proxy deployed for that. So whatever logic that I'm deploying, I can choose VRO server or ABX actions. Now my HCRA environment, that environment is pretty much standard. You can see that's a single network, which is HCRA net. But then only thing that I need to take care of is, since this is VMware Cloud on AWS, there are two different resource pool. One is management resource pool and then compute resource pool. Now when VMware Cloud Automation Services goes ahead and then discovers this environment, it would tell you that okay, I can deploy in both the environment. But then if you want to really deploy it at the MGMT resource pool, it would fail. You do not have the permission to deploy there. So at the deployment time, you need to make sure that the deployments go to compute resource pool. That's the requirement. In my on-prem, the private location, this is more to resemble a production environment. So I have two region under one vCenter server. I have two data centers, data center A and then data center 2, that is data center 1 and 2. So region A and region B, both the regions are further segregated into production, and then say cluster 1 and then cluster 2, right? So one is used as a production environment and the other one is used as test environment. Inside the production environment, I have networks, net as net production, net dev, prod, and then dev environment. And then in test environment, it's typically just dev network that's available there, right? The other thing is both the environment, if you see the zone A and zone B, they are based out of there is a separate segregation, that one is in Palo Alto, another one is marked as Burlington. So I can simply say that okay, I want to deploy to Palo Alto location, so I need to select Palo Alto, and then the other one is Burlington. So the environment typically mirrors each other, the Palo Alto location and the Burlington location, but the locations are different. Now, if you look at my tagging strategy, I have a larger tag which is location. That's the name of the tag, and then colon, either it can be HCRA or CMBU lab. So look at this strategy. If I select location and then CMBU lab, that means it's going to choose the right side of the environment. If I select HCRA, it's on the left hand side, right? Now first I need to select compute constraints. So if I am selecting location CMBU lab, and then I need to select whether I want to deploy it in Palo Alto or Burlington, then I have LOC, that's the tag name. So I can select either Palo Alto or Burlington. That means I'm going deeper, which region I want to deploy. And then the last one is environment, which is ENV. I want to deploy to production or test. So it would select whether it wants to deploy in production or test environment, right? For networking, I have only production and dev, prod or dev. If I'm deploying on the test environment, so obviously it's the networking is going to be in dev. And if I'm selecting prod environment, then I can either select prod or dev. That's as simple as that. That's how I'm driving my deployment. I'm making sure that my deployment is going there. And if I want to deploy to HCRA, so only deployment tagging that I need to use is location HCRA plus VM type colon workload. That's the VM type. So that's the workload type. It should go to compute resource pool. That's how I'm driving my deployment, selecting, making sure that whatever VM that I deployed should go there location. And the network is location HCRA. That's my entire lab environment, and I'm going to show you that exactly based on the tags that I select, it goes ahead and deploys in that particular environment. Clear? Let's move ahead. So this is the blueprint that I'm using, and then this blueprint actually uses tags and then inputs that I'm going to talk about just in few seconds. Before I go ahead and explain that, this is how the blueprint looks. It's pretty simple, just basic blueprint, but then it shows how I can take inputs and then utilize it, and then how I can use the tags at the runtime. I let the users select what they want to deploy and where they want to deploy, right? Next big thing, you have tags, and then I can statically define tags, or I can at the runtime let users choose where what they want to do. So that for that I have inputs. What inputs does actually, that at the runtime it asks for the inputs from the users. Okay, what do you want to do? I have these options, and then you can go ahead and play around with that. So it inputs section to your blueprint code, where you define what you want to input for, and then you access those input variables into the resources section. That's where you access those. And then the typical syntax is dollar and then the curly braces. Within the curly braces, you access that variable that you have defined in the input section by input dot and then the property name syntax. You should go through the documentation of, you know I'll just show you the documents that you should read on that. Mm, let's move over to the documents. So the first thing, this documentation is pretty extensive from VMware official website. You should read that. This is really really helpful. Okay, so this is the first expressions, how you use define and uses the expressions in your blueprints. Just go through that pretty quick, neat way of utilizing those expressions. And then the next one is expression syntax. What are the things that you can do? It defines and then it clearly details what the things, or what are the things that you can utilize, the conditions, all that stuff. You can really play around with inputs. And you should, if you are serious about custom forms, dynamic inputs, or the runtime inputs from the end users and using it, you should go through this link. And then the last one is how user input can customize a cloud assembly blueprint, where it gives you certain examples and then shows what are the things that you can do through example. So this portion of cloud assembly documentation is really extensive and really really helpful. Okay, so definitely go ahead and have a look at that. And let me log into my cloud account and show the blueprint that I have and how I have defined the tags, and then I'm using the inputs in my blueprint. And so this is what I'm logging here. Let's log into the service broker. I have already created the blueprint and then defined the service custom form here. Before we go ahead and actually use this custom example, where I can provide a deploy name, and then I can select the project and then select the network, production dev environment. You remember the networks that I had shown you for the network. And then host name, I can provide a custom host name. I can provide the location, VMC on AWS or CMBU lab, and then I can select the region, Palo Alto or Burlington, and then I can select the environment, whether it's production or test. So that's pretty much how you do it. Let me go ahead and have a look at the cloud assembly blueprint. So this is the blueprint that I have. You see that it's just a single VM with three constraints that I have, and for network I have a single constraint that is defined. Now it's a Linux environment. This is a blueprint for Ubuntu. Things that this is the input section. That's where I ask for the inputs from the end users. So whatever comes under inputs are the variables where I'm defining the variables, and then the resources section is where I'm accessing those variables. So first thing that I'm asking for a host name, custom host name. Please enter the name of the host. That's what I'm asking. The next thing is I'm asking is location. It can be it's a string type, and then title is location. That's how it's going to come. Now enum is the portion where I'm defining predefining my values, so it's going to create a drop down for me. So VMC on AWS or CMBU lab, let me just have it opened side by side so that we can see that actually in it. Okay, so here I have defined location, right? So location is a drop down VMC on AWS and CMBU lab, and then if you click on the information, it says please select the location where to deploy. So whatever you define in description is going to be as inputs in custom form. Then the region name, I selected Palo Alto or Burlington. If you go here and then select a region, you see Palo Alto or Burlington, and I'm asking for environment, whether it's production or test environment, and then network, I'm just selecting the network, whether it's production or dev network. And now here where the constraints that I'm putting, see it's coming under constraints, and then the tag that I'm putting, it's like tag colon and then input dot location. So the location input, if it's a VMC on AWS, so if it's VMC on AWS, that's the of a value that I select. So the value, the tags that is going to be is location colon HCRA. So that's the constraint that is going to put. But then if it's location dot HCR and then a net to lower input dot network, the whatever input dot network that I have, it's just going to be on the lower field. And then for the properties, VM properties, if you see that the image that I'm going to select, based on that, if it's CMBU lab, if the location that I select, if it's CMBU lab, then it's going to select Ubuntu 18.04. Otherwise it's going to select RHEL 8.0. So I have a RHEL machine in HCRA, and then I have Ubuntu machine in CMBU lab. So based on the location, I can change my image. It's going to change or deploy a machine with that particular image operating system. And the constraints tags that I select, see there are three constraints that I'm putting. If the location is VMC on AWS, that the location is HCRA, otherwise it's going to be CMBU lab. The other thing is if it's CMBU lab, then the location tabs within CMBU lab is going to be input dot region name. So that means the region and the name that I'm going to select, it's going to be applied here. If it's not VMC.AWS, if it's VMC on AWS, that's what I select. So it's just going to be a blank value here. So it's not applicable. Same thing, if I am again selecting CMBU-lab as my location, then environment is going to be whatever environment that I selected. If it's not CMBU-lab, then it's just going to be a blank, because I don't need, you remember that in my environment, HCRA doesn't need all those in-depth like location and then whether it's production or test environment. It's just simple. So if it's HCRA, that's the environment that I select, it's just simply going to be uh, deploying on VMC on AWS. That doesn't need any other environment. So that's how my blueprint looks, and then exactly how you define inputs and then use them. And this is also an example. I wanted to show this blueprint because it also shows how flexible it can be and how you can implement or incorporate your own logic to select something. So let's first go ahead and do a deploy. From here, say deploy test 1, and then the blueprint version, say version 2.0, and then host name, say test 1, and then location, let's select CMBU lab. That has the most options there. So I'm going to select Palo Alto, and then environment, I'm going to select prod, and then network is prod environment. Select deploy. Let's go ahead and do another deployment, say test 2 blueprint 2.2, and then the host name is test 2, Let's select again CMBU lab. Region is Burlington. Environment is prod deploy. Okay, I changed something. It seems I have made some changes. Test 3. Let's select the VMC on AWS, and then really doesn't matter which region I choose. It's not going to make difference for me because it's just VMC on AWS. You see, you had seen that it's going to be blank for every one of them. Oh, this environment is not working, unavailable for deployment for my deployment. So there is some problem in my environment. That's why the deployments are failing. I need to go ahead and troubleshoot that. Uh, but the other environment is working fine. So see, there is another thing that I wanted to mention. This environment is pretty much okay, but there is a warning. This environment is not available for deployment. Um, Somehow it seems my proxy, I have some problem in my environment. This is a test environment, so that's the problem. The other thing that's amazing about cloud VMC on AWS or VMware Cloud Assembly is when something breaks, when it doesn't work, I see that's machine allocation and what are the issues that happened. So it couldn't find me any cloud zones. So it's just couldn't find me any cloud zones. So I have three cloud zones in that environment. So for this actually plans out the entire logic. So if you create any your tagging has any problem, it's not properly matching, it'll be able to see why it failed. Actually this uh, failure gives me an opportunity to explain how to troubleshoot your track tagging environment. So I see that I requested for a virtual machine. I said that the image should be 18.04 Ubuntu because I selected CMBU lab, and there are three hard constraints on that particular resource is location, CMBU lab, and you remember I said that if you do not mention anything, still is the default is hard. So by default you can see it's hard. The location is Burlington, and then environment in production is production. So the two options are you have this is the project that I have. Under that project there are three different cloud zones. The flavors matched the zones. I see that the zone, that HCRA zone, there's no mapping image available. So this is where it fails. So it's not going to select this portion. But then I have images available in these two environments, data center 2 and data center 7. But then within that, the cloud zone that I have, the endpoint is powered off. Mm. So this is why it's not available for deployment. So I need to go ahead and I need to check what happened with my collector, why the collector is failing, and then why it's not able to uh, talk to my endpoint. And this is a little bit of troubleshooting that I'm doing as and when I'm explaining things. So let's go ahead and check the proxy. I see that the collector CMBU lab, that proxy is perfectly fine. ABX is also perfectly fine. So the proxies are that I have deployed in that environment are fine. So there is some problem with my environment. Let me see the try to validate and then work, or otherwise I will have to check with that environment. So the connection with the cloud proxy is lost. So perhaps I need to reboot my collector and see whether this environment that I have is on a nested environment. It's hosted on a cloud and a nested environment, so it's pretty unstable. So I know that this environment has issues, a lot of issues. So it is expected, but then I didn't expect that to crop up right now. Well, I will have to go ahead and troubleshoot that, but if you can see that this other deployment is going on, and this is how it should